Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Alan Talbot, and I'm a Baba lover from the San Francisco Bay Area, a little town called Moraga, California. I've been with Baba since 1969 and heard about him first in 1968. I'm married for about 40 years. I have three kids, three grandkids, two of whom were just here this week. Two of my kids were just here this week, and my three kids and grandkids are all Baba lovers. So we're very fortunate. But I'm not here this morning to talk about my family directly, or me. I've given my Baba story in 2005 at Mayor House. It's on the Michael LePage YouTube website. And I also gave two other YouTubes on the story of my natural food store in Berkeley in the 70s called Holy Foods. And those were given at the ALA Baba Center, one in September 2012 and one in April 2013. And those are about 2.5 hours long. They're very fascinating. This morning, however, I'm here to talk about my grandfather, who amazingly at about the age of 80 became a Baba lover. And his story deserves the telling. Now, in truth, I don't know a great deal about my grandfather, but the other day I did call his last living child, my Uncle Gene, who's 93. And amazingly, as children would be, he didn't know a great deal about his father either, more than I knew. But I do want to tell this story to the extent we know it. I'm assuming everything I tell here is true. My grandfather was a great storyteller, so if the story's not true, only Baba knows if it's not true, because nobody's alive not to know it. Anyway, he was born in apparently 1892. I checked the 1940 census in America, and that's the date of his birth. And we'll assume for the sake of discussion that's correct, and it seems correct. He was born near Kiev, Russia, in a small village called a shtetl, where the Russian Jews lived in those days. His name was Joseph Tabachnik. May have been different, but that's the one I got, as I knew it. He told us at the age of 13, 1905, he escaped from Russia and walked across Europe to take a boat to the United States. There's actually, in discussing this with my uncle, some logic to this. Number one, in 1905, there were massive, what's called pogroms in Russia. And Russian Jews were being mercilessly beaten and killed. In fact, three of my grandparents came at the same time, and that was their basis. In addition, Jewish boys at the age of 13 were taken, actually kidnapped into the Russian army for 25 years. This I know independent of any story. And that would essentially end up killing them. And at the same time, remarkably, the Russians were in a war with Japan in 1905. So all these factors led, apparently, my grandfather to escape to America. And he came to Ellis Island. And he had one older brother. His name was Jake. And I think I met my great uncle Jake a couple occasions. But my grandfather had no parents, no grandparents, no cousins, etc. Basically came to America as a 13-year-old boy, if that's true. He married my grandmother, whose name was Gussie Skolnick, in apparently 1914. And their first child, my father, was born in 1916, Bernard. He had four other children: Beatrice, 1918, Laura, about 19, Jean, who I just mentioned, 1926, and Edie, 1928. Everyone is gone, including their spouses. However, we do have good rapport with all my cousins and even cousins' children, and even cousins' children's children. So it's kind of interesting that the family is, in its own way, stayed together through weddings and such like that, and just relationships. My grandfather was very poor. They lived on the Lower East Side of New York. Father grew up in utter poverty. My uncle told me that at some point, perhaps before he was born in 1926, they moved to Harlem, which was then a Jewish neighborhood. eventually to the East Bronx, which I didn't even know about. I'm not even sure where that is. And eventually to the place where I knew them in the West Bronx. I didn't know there was a West Bronx. I'll assume if there's an East Bronx, there must be a... And there they lived on a street called Nelson Avenue. It was off what's called the Grand Concourse, which is this humongous street in the Bronx, which seems like a quarter of a mile across. I've never seen a bigger street in my life. And about a mile from Yankee Stadium. And amazingly enough, my father told me when he was about 16, he would go over to Yankee Stadium after school, a school called Stuyvesant High School. He was very smart. And he remembered Lou Gehrig. And I cross-examined him a little bit, and he did not remember Babe Ruth. So that meant it was 1932 because Ruth had left by then. And I ran the names of various players on the Yankees, which he couldn't remember. But he did remember Gehrig, who's a very famous person. Now, this apartment, I guess you would call where my grandparents lived, I'll describe it. It was on a narrow street where there was definitely no parking. I remember driving up from Philadelphia where I lived with my mother and father. My mother was from Philadelphia, my sister and brother. And my father would drive around endlessly trying to find a parking place, although he would drop us all off in front of the apartment. And the whole street was apartments, so that's why there was no parking. It was a building that if you faced it, it was like a U. You went up some stairs, there was a big courtyard, and on each side, on the right, on the left, there were apartments, and on the back there was apartments. So it was gobs of people living in this complex. I think it was about 4 stories and had absolutely no elevator. So fortunately for my grandparents, if you faced the building, they were on the right side on the first floor. And as we would come, my grandmother, who anticipated our arrival, her head would always be out the window. She was a bit of a worrier, for what I gather. Got that from my father got that from her. He was a bit of a worrier. My grandfather didn't strike me as a worrier, on the contrary. And so we would all hustle into the building, and their apartment was kind of interesting. I grew up in what's called a row house in Philadelphia with a lawn, and kind of more rural than this urban setting where there was no grass. A lot of glass, no grass. You'd go into the apartment, immediately to your left was a very little kitchenette area, very small. That was our kitchen. Thereafter was the master bedroom. And I remember my grandmother was always ill. She was a grossly overweight woman when I knew her. She was beautiful and thin when she was young. And she always snored, and the door was glass in part, and she made the door rattle. We always thought as a kid that was quite humorous. Then there was a long hall, and at the end of the long hall was I guess at that point, a TV room. I remember once going there and they played Rebel Without a Cause on one of the independent channels like 24/7. I thought that was fascinating. You could watch this movie anytime throughout the day. You get it, any part of it. In Philadelphia, we only had 3 main channels. And then to the left were 2 other bedrooms and a bathroom, and 5 kids had to live in that at various ages, I guess. Anyway, my grandfather, when I knew him, had a hand laundry. I think he had a hand laundry his whole life. This is unique. A hand laundry meant they had to do all the laundry by hand. Maybe they had machines later, I don't know. And when I went over to his business, it was a long counter. Obviously, they had a back room, and they had packages of the laundry, and it was all taped up with string. I remember that. And the whole wall was just laundry, and people would come in and pick up their laundry and write their names on there. His first language was Yiddish, and his English wasn't that great. I don't think my grandmother ever learned English too much at all. Maybe she could spell her name. They read Yiddish papers. My grandfather must have known how to write English a little bit, and certainly know how to do arithmetic in order to be in business. He was an extremely friendly person. When I was in his business a couple of times, I noticed his interaction with the customers. He was about 5'10". He was very strong. He was bald when I knew him. My father also was bald. Kind of had a hooked nose. My father got his wife's pug nose, which I kind of have. And he was very, very cordial to the customers, probably most of whom were Italian or Jewish, I would guess. It was on a big street. I don't know the name of the street. He had two employees. One was a black guy named Milton, which was quite unusual in those days, that you would have a black employee, as I understood it. And he was kind of a short guy and very loving. And my uncle said he was kind of part of the family. And here's something I didn't know, but it makes sense. They had a lady in the back room who did the ironing of the laundry named Blanche. That was all news to me. That was a new fact. But it makes sense they have somebody ironing. And maybe I knew this when I was a kid. I do remember one time going to an ice cream parlor with my grandfather, and I wanted ice cream, and I wanted what was called Jimmy's. In Philadelphia, the chocolate things you dip into the ice cream cone is called Jimmy's. So when I asked the guy for Jimmy's, he looked blank, and then I pointed to them, and he said, no, those are called sprinkles in New York. So we had a good laugh over that. But my grandfather was very gracious. He liked to take us out. And he one time took me to Yankee Stadium to see a Yankees game. And I was so impressed with how big Yankee Stadium was compared to even the Philadelphia ballpark, which was called Connie Mack Stadium, which was big enough as it was as a kid. We must have walked over there. I don't have a clue how we would have gotten there. Maybe it was, some municipal carway or something, or maybe my father drove us over and dropped us off. My father was not there. It was just my grandfather. When I was probably about 9 or 10, we would go visit my aunt and uncle, the one I just mentioned, who lived up in an area called Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And he was a psychologist up there. He worked at a place called Austin Riggs originally, where the famous psychologist Erik Erikson worked. So he went there for Erikson, and then he left for his own practice after a while. We would go there every summer. And one summer we took my grandparents, and my grandfather, I guess because he worked with water, thought he knew how to swim. The man had never been in a swimming pool his entire life, but he convinced me, I was probably 9 or 10, to go in an inner tube out into this lake. So we're out there in the lake, and the inner tube flipped over. The man didn't know how to swim. I knew how to swim because I would swim, but the poor man didn't know how to swim. And I don't know how far out we were, about at least 100 feet, I'm sure. So my Uncle Gene was the hero, and he came out, swam out there, and took us and the inner tube back. I remember him holding me and my grandfather at the same time. My grandfather was a little bit embarrassed by that, as it were, because he realized he didn't know how to swim and he almost drowned himself and his grandson. I was the second oldest grandchild. Now, when we would go to families' affairs, like a bar mitzvah or a wedding or something, my grandfather was the life of the party. There'd be 150, 200 people there, and he would dance in the middle of the floor. And eventually everybody would clear out because he was an extraordinary dancer. He could do this Russian dance where you get down on your hunches and you kick your legs out. I don't know what the name is, Shotsky or something like that. And he would dance around and get a little drunk. He was fantastic. And as a child, I thought, well, this guy is somebody. And I admired this. And I thought, like, if I could be like this, I would really be something special. So when I became a teenager, I was from Philadelphia, where bandstand was, and all we did was dance. I never studied and played ball. I became a really great dancer, inspired, I realized later in life, by my grandfather. And I would go out on the floor and dance, and then I'd have a couple hundred people watching me. And I thought of him when I was doing that. So he really inspired that kind of nature in me. And my father was the exact opposite. He was more like his mother, kind of an introverted, quiet person, although he was kind of brilliant. Whereas my grandfather was very outgoing. And we'd only see them once or twice a year, at Christmas or in the summer once. And it was about an hour and a half from Philadelphia to New York. But really never spent any private time because I was growing up and the whole family was there, and then cousins and aunts and uncles, and there was a whole scene going on. I do remember their 50th wedding anniversary in 1964. We went up to New York and they had it in a restaurant of some sort, I'm not sure the name. And I do remember they had the American flag there and we did the Pledge of Allegiance. They were thrilled to be in America, as all my grandparents were. And it was a great thing. They escaped certain death in Russia, if not directly from the Russians, certainly from the Holocaust. And again, I never knew, and my father never knew a thing about his grandparents or any of his relatives. All he had was his Uncle Jake and his apparently two cousins. His cousin Bernie, they changed their name to Talbot, and we changed their names to Talbot after the Second World War. His cousin Bernie, originally Tabachnik, later Talbot, became president of Seagram Corporation. And he had another brother, apparently, I found out from my uncle, named Sam, who actually worked, he was a psychiatrist, at Austin Riggs before my uncle did, which is amazing. My uncle just found this out too. So it was kind of humorous. I found out I had a new relative, and there's probably kids and grandkids, etc., in that line. All right, so I didn't see my grandparents for years. I went to college and became a hippie, did a lot of drugs, and eventually in 1969 became a Bible lover. And I went out to the Bay Area finally in June of '69. And my grandparents were not in my mind. They were not really in my mind. I think I saw them once in numerous years. And they were elderly people. I think they were both born in 1892. And then my grandmother died in 1971. So she would have been 79. Her health had been very bad, as I mentioned earlier. And the neighborhood in which my grandfather was living, as I described, had gotten worse. And so my relatives decided to move him to a city called Yonkers, which is right north, as I understand it, of the Bronx. And I think I've been in Yonkers once. Excuse me. In any event, for some reason, only Baba knows, I decided to send my grandfather, now that he was living on his own in his apartment, and my parents described this to me, two posters, two big Baba posters, which I got from Mayor Baba Information, Rick Chapman, which I also sold in my natural food store, and also had them in the windows where millions of people saw Baba's image face. The Don't Worry, Be Happy poster and the I Am the Ancient One poster. So I took those two posters, rolled them up in a tube, and mailed them to my grandfather. I never thought about it again. And then a year later, 1972, I went and visited my parents. I would only go back once a year. Now, I had long hair and a beard. The hair eventually got to my butt, and the hair got down to the middle of my chest. Although I wasn't doing drugs, I was a Baba guy. Eventually cut that in 1973. But in any event, at that time, I had long hair and a beard. Went back to my parents' house where I'd lived, and they had lived since 1947. It was the last little section of Philadelphia called Overbrook Park, surrounded by two golf courses, on one side woods, hundreds of acres of woods at the bottom of my street, and the Philadelphia Main Line to the west. It was secluded. We called it Little Tel Aviv. It was like 7,500 people, probably 90% Jewish or more, a few Italians. That was about it. We had everything. We were self-secluded. My grandfather came down from Yonkers to be with my parents. Apparently there was a religious ceremony to be had a year after my grandmother's death at her gravesite. I didn't think anything about it. My parents were working, so I actually spent a week with my grandfather. And this is where I got the stories which I'm about to relate. I did want to tell you about his background so you would have an idea of what kind of person he was. He apparently, from what my uncle said, did close his store for the Jewish holidays, but I never saw him as a religious person. I don't know that he ever went to synagogue necessarily. I don't think he knew Hebrew particularly. He was busy. He was working 6 days a week, probably 14 hours a day, just to survive in the world. So religion was not an essential part of his life. So we were there, and my parents would leave in the morning to go to work. It was just my grandfather and me. And one of my dearest friends had just gotten a divorce. He got married too young, got a divorce, and he had gone back to live with his parents for some reason. So I remember this, going to visit him at his house, which was a few blocks from my parents' house. And he was a very he was the kind of guy that would not tell you his emotions. You had to work on it to get anything out of him. Probably it was the reason his wife wanted to divorce him, I'm guessing. And my grandfather, who had no education, literally no education, but was a terrific psychologist because of his dealings with people, spent an hour and a half getting information out of this fellow named Douglas. And it was amazing. He did more in an hour and a half than I did in years. And then we left, and we're walking back to my parents' house, and I said, "How did you do that?" The man never tells you his feelings, which is probably the reason he got a divorce. And he pointed to his head. He said, "I have no education, but I'm a psychology man. I pump him dry. I get all the information out of him, and then I let him know what it's all about." So I suspect that's how my Uncle Gene, who is a doctor of psychology, got his clever mind for psychology, because he's amazingly at 93 still practicing part-time. Anyway, we got back to my parents' house. It was only a 10-minute walk. It was a lovely day. I think it was in June or July of 1972. And just the two of us are there. And somehow I got the gumption after seeing him in action. I was so impressed to talk to him. And he started telling me about things. He said, "After your grandmother died, I had never taken a vacation. So I decided to take a vacation." So I said, "So where'd you go?" He said, "Well, I went down to Miami, and I went to this hotel. And at this hotel, I was going to go for 2 weeks. I got there, and I thought, this is wonderful." And he said, "But I got there, and everybody was sitting on the porch with furs on, and it was in the summer, and it was really hot." And I said to them, "Why are you people sitting?" And they were on rocking chairs on the porch of this hotel. "Why are you just sitting there?" And they said, "Well, we're just sitting here because that's what we want to do." He said, "Have you people been in the water?" And they said, "No." He said, he hadn't even been into the hotel yet. He said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to go to my room. I'm going to get my bathing suit," the great swimmer that he was. "And I want you people to go to your rooms and get in your bathing suits, and we're going to the beach." And I'm sitting here in my parents' house listening to him. And I said, "So what happened, Grandpa?" He said, "Well, we all went to the beach." I said, "You went to the beach? You got these people?" He said, "Yes." I said, meaning Joe said to these people, "Has anybody been in the water?" And they all said no. He says, "Well, okay, I want you to put your towels down, and I want you to go to the water and put your right foot in." And they went to the water and they put the right foot in. And then I said, "Put your left foot in." And they put their left foot in. And I said, "I want you to walk into the water and throw water on your chest." And they did it. And they all started going, "Hee hee 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 hee." That's how he described it. And we all got wet. We were swimming around. I'm thinking, like, this guy doesn't know how to swim. He almost drowned me when I was a kid. But nonetheless, he was having a good time in his stories. And I said, "So what happened then?" I said, "Well, these people went back, after we went swimming, we went back to the hotel, and it was time for lunch." So I said, "So what'd you do?" He said, "Well, you know, these people had crutches and canes and all these walkers and such like that. And I told them that they have to put all those things down. And we're going to walk into the dining hall." The way that the hotel worked, it was a big dining hall, and it was a buffet line, and you would stand in line, and you would get your food, and then you would eat at the tables. And everybody was friendly because they all knew each other, and you had to meet strangers and become friends with strangers. So I said, okay. So I said, this is interesting, I'm thinking to myself. So what happened? He said, well, we walked into the dining hall. They all left their crutches and canes and walkers in their rooms. And I told them they had to walk in with their chest out and their stomach in, with their hands going like this, like we were in the military. And my grandfather had a very nice posture. He was very strong, so he didn't use any of those orthopedic devices. So I said, okay. So I said, well, we walked in and everybody clapped for us. And I said, well, this, and I'm thinking to myself, this is interesting. He's got these people going. After a week, we had a whole crew of people. And we would walk in and people would give us a standing ovation. I thought, well, how many people could he have? So I said, Grandpa, how many people were behind you in the line? He said, 200. I said, 200 people. He said, basically the entire dining hall was behind me. And just a few people were seated when we would come in. I said, wait a minute. You had 200 people in the entire hotel following you? Yeah, and we were walking like this. They all put their crutches and canes and like we were in the army. And the people would stand and give us an ovation. And I started laughing. I said, I'm thinking to myself, this is unbelievable. And he said, yes, after a week, they thought I was God, and I thought I was God. And this was the line, I told this story in Mandalay Hall to Erich and Balnatu. Balnatu actually took me in to Mandalay Hall at Merazad because he said Erich will want to hear this story because I had told him this story. And Erich said it was one of the best stories he'd ever heard, especially on that line. I said, so Grandpa, what happened? He said, well, I had the entire place going. We were playing games and everybody was dancing. We were having a great time. But I had to leave after 2 weeks. I said, what do you mean you had to leave after 2 weeks? He said, well, my money ran out. I said, your money ran out? He said, yeah, my money ran out. I said, wait a minute, the owner of the hotel didn't keep you on as like entertainment? In Jewish world, in hotels, they would call this person a tumler. A tumler is the guy that keeps the action going. Like Buddy Hackett was a tumler, or Phil Silvers, or Mel Brooks. Funny guys who could keep the activity so people didn't get bored. He said, that's what I said to the guy. And the people wanted me to stay there and be the tumler. I said, this is the craziest thing I've heard. The guy let you go? I would have paid you if I was the owner to stay there. People were having, he said, that's what I told him. But he didn't listen. He was a stupid man. So I had to leave. I said, you had to leave. He said, I had to leave. I said, well, this is a crazy story. I would have kept you on for days, for months, if necessary. He said, that's what I was thinking. That was a pure entertainment for these people. Anyway, I went back to New York, and I would go to what they call senior citizen places. I decided to date, and your parents and all your aunts and uncles said, Papa, why are you going out? Can't you remember your wife of 70 years? Or nearly 70 years, whatever it was, 60 years. Why are you he said, look, I only have a few years left of my life. Do you want me to be happy or do you want me to be unhappy? I choose to be happy. I'm a happy person. So let me have some fun for the few years I have left. And it was a hard argument, so he started going to these senior citizens homes or sessions, and there'd be like 50 women and 2 guys. And so when the guys would walk in, because all the women outlived their husbands, they had all this money, so they had the Cadillacs and the cars and the furs and the diamonds and the jewels and the money. And they would date my grandfather because he was so charming and funny. But he had a rule. Come up and they would take him out to dinner and to the movies in their fancy cars. He would dress up and he would tell them jokes and such like that. But if they started complaining about anything, he would say to them, look, I have a few years left of my life, and so do you really. I'm not going to listen to complaints. I'm only going to listen to happy talk. So if you continue to complain, you could just take me home right now. I'll go out with somebody else. I can call them immediately. And so they would change their mood and they would become happy. So you would have a good time with them. So I'm listening to these stories. This guy's telling me. I'm going, who is this guy? I mean, I hardly know this guy, but he's telling me these stories. So then it dawned on me that I said, Grandpa, I sent you a couple posters in the tube. Did you get those posters? He said, I did. So now I'm a little unclear how this is going to go. Mind you, his English is not great. I said, well, what'd you do with the posters? He said, well, I put them up. I have a bedroom. I have this nice little apartment. There's a bedroom, and I put them above my bed. I took some thumbtacks, and one poster says, don't worry, be happy. And the other one says, I am the Ancient One. I said, yeah. He said, well, I put them above there. And I would talk to Baba, And he was my best friend. I would talk to him all the time. And then in the building, the apartment building, there was a bunch of hippie kids that looked like you. They liked to go out with me because I was fun. So he said, the hippie kids would come to the door. They reminded me of you and your cousin Michael, because you have long hair, and Michael became a gynecologist in due time, a little younger than I was. And they would come into my apartment, and they say, Joe, we got to go. We're out to dinner, and then we're going to go to the movies. He said, hold on a second. I have to go to my room for a sec. And I would go in my room and close the door, and I'd say, Baba, the hippie kids are here. We're going to go out. I'll be back maybe 10:30, 11. And he said, Baba said to me, Joe, go out, have a good time. I'll be here when you get back. We could talk then. And I'm going, so Alan's thinking to himself, wait a minute. Grandpa, you're talking to Baba? He said, Alan, he was my best friend. I talked to him all the time. We had continuous conversations. And my mind is reeling now. I cannot believe I'm hearing this. Mind you, all he knows is the two pictures and what's on the two pictures. The man could not read a discourse, let alone God speaks, or anything like that. And he had no religious background, as I mentioned earlier, so it's purely from his heart. So I had brought God Speaks with me. I was going to go to Myrtle Beach after I left my parents' house, and I was reading it, I guess. So I said, hold on a second, Grandpa, and I got the book. And I opened the book to the frontispiece where Baba's pictures is. I said, Grandpa, here he is. And he pointed to the picture like that, and he said, Alan, he is the one. And now I was going to test him a little bit. Not my place, but I thought, what do you mean, Grandpa, he is the one? He said, Alan, he is the one. This is exactly the intonation of his voice. And I said, Grandpa, what do you mean he is the one? And he took his finger and he put it on Baba's head with force like that and held it there. He said, Alan, he is the one. And I was stunned. And just then my parents came home and kind of interrupted the conversation. So I couldn't continue that part of the conversation. Now, later that night, or the next day, I realized I was going to come to Myrtle Beach, where I am right now, at Robin Vogel's house. And I had this feeling. I said, Grandpa, I'm going to this place called Myrtle Beach. And I described the Mayor Spiritual Center. My first trip had been the year before in 1971. And I'm going to be leaving in like 2-3 days, whatever it was. And I'm going to be going for a week. And I described the whole thing. And I described there were two elderly women who ran the place, Elizabeth Patterson and Kitty Davy, and who they were and their backgrounds. And I said, would you be interested in going? And he said, absolutely. And I was stunned. I said, are you sure? He said, yeah. My parents were not there. They were at work. So I said, well, let me call down and see if this could work out. So I somehow had the number for the center, and I used my parents' phone, and I called down, and I got Kitty. And I said, Kitty, this is Alan Talbot, and I am coming to the center in a few days. And I told her a little bit about my grandfather, and I said, he's interested in coming with me. Would that be all right? And I could hear in the background a little laughter of Kitty, and Elizabeth's right with her. And Kitty says, oh, very good, very good. And let me talk to your grandfather, let me talk to your grandfather. Kitty always said the same thing twice. Whatever she said, she repeated it. So I said to I held my hand over the speaker part. I said, Grandpa, this is the English lady. I had told him that she'd been introduced to the Queen. And this is the guy who owned a hand laundry in the Bronx. So this was going to be a clash of civilization. He says, no problem. He gets on the phone and he starts talking to her. And he talks to her for about 10 minutes. And he's telling her jokes. And he's standing there. I'm sitting on the chair, and he's standing there, and he's doing material, and she's laughing hysterically. And Elizabeth, I could hear, who hardly ever laughed, was laughing hysterically in the background. And I'm in the presence of some master here, and Kitty's beside herself with laughter, and Elizabeth in the background. And he's telling them he'll come down and they'll go dancing and he'll entertain them. And it went on and on. And after about 10 minutes or so, he says, she wants to talk to you. So I get on the phone. I'm a little hesitant. I don't know what's going on here. I think, wow, this could be pretty wild. I said, yes, Kitty. He says, oh, I very much like your grandfather. And Elizabeth would like to talk to you. Elizabeth would like to talk to you. So Elizabeth gets on the phone. Now, she was the exact opposite of Kitty. She was very subdued, steady, reliable, and soft-spoken. Hello, Alan. I said, hi, Elizabeth. I knew them a little bit from the prior year. We got along quite well. I got along quite well with both of them. I'd spent some time with them. She says, I was listening to the conversation that Kitty was having with your grandfather. Could I speak to your grandfather? I said, of course. So I said, hold on for a sec. So I put my hand over the phone, the speaker. I said, Grandpa, this is the lady in charge. This is the American. Now I describe, I reiterate who she is. He says, no problem. So I give him the phone, and he gets on. He starts doing another 10 minutes of material with Elizabeth, and they're going to go dancing, and he's going to tell them jokes, and he's going to, they're going to have a great time, and she's laughing hysterically, and you can hear Kitty in the background laughing hysterically. And after whatever the time passed, I'm watching this in utter amazement. This is like the master at work. I figure if I had 1/100th of this man, I'm somebody. And he says, Elizabeth would like to talk to you. I said, okay. And I take the phone. I have no idea what she's going to say. She says, Alan, Kitty and I would very much like for your grandfather to come to the center. I said, I anticipated that, Elizabeth. She says, we look forward to it with enthusiasm or something like that, or great enthusiasm. I said, I will try and make the arrangements to the best of my ability. She says, good, I hope it could occur. And we hung up. Well, anyway, in due course, my parents came home, and I described the situation to them, which stunned them, shocked them, and mildly horrified them, but they were okay. But one of them, probably my mother, who paid attention to detail, said, you understand why your grandfather is down here. He's down here because we have to do this unveiling of your grandmother's, of his wife's tombstone in New Jersey, at the cemetery. And my grandfather had forgotten about it by this point. He could care less. Frankly, neither could my father. My mother was ritualistically religious. So the rituals of religion were important in her mind. Although she came to the center later and met Darwin and went to the barn and all that. So she had a sense of Baba. But in any event, there was grave disappointment in the ranks because my mother put the kibosh down because the other family members who were coming to New Jersey, they too were at best religiously religious. We didn't have a religious side on the Tabachnik side. So he couldn't go. So I had to call down to the center and tell Kitty or Elizabeth, and whoever I spoke to said, Alan, when you come down, immediately call us. We want you to come over. We want to talk to you about your grandfather. I said, okay. So I went down to the center, and they called me in, and they really were looking forward with great anticipation to my grandfather's arrival. First off, they didn't get many 80-year-old Bible lovers. And secondly, they believed from everything he told them, they were going to go dancing and they were going to get jokes and entertainment. They weren't used to that. They didn't have people their age do that. They had to suffer through people our age, the grandkids, not the grandparents, their own age. So they were really excited about my grandfather. And of course, he was very disappointed himself. Well, anyway, he went and did his unveiling and so on and so forth. Well, naturally, I'm living in California. He's in Yonkers. And a couple years later, I visited my aunt and uncle in the Berkshires in Stockbridge and drove down, and my grandfather was in the hospital. And I went to see him, and he was frankly near death, and he mixed me up By this point, I had cut my hair and beard, so he mixed me up with my a little bit younger cousin, Michael. He didn't look like me, but good enough. And my grandfather was, not altogether there. And that was the last time I saw him. Now, I went to India in 1977, and I was on the veranda at Merazad, and Balnath too liked good stories. He liked good stories. So I sat there on the bench with him and told him the story, and his mouth was agape, and his eyes were bulging the more I told him, which I've just told you this story. Probably had more details then because it was 42 years ago, this being 2019. And after I was done, he said, "You have to tell this story to Urich," who was in Mondeley Hall with the usual 20, 30, whatever number of people. So the door was closed. We opened the door. He opened the door, and he said, "Urich, stop right now. Alan's going to tell you the story of his grandfather." Now, Urich was always happy for somebody else to talk. So I sat down and told the entire story again. And Balnath too and Urich were roaring, and I told the story as I've told here. Again, probably with more facts, more details, maybe more emotion because it was closer in time. And then it was over. Years later, and I don't recall which trip it was to India, I'm at Merazad, and I'm just sitting there on one of the benches in front of Mondeley Hall, and Balnath too sidles up to me and says, "I would like you to tell Urich the story again in Mondeley Hall of your grandfather." And I looked blank at him. I said, "What story?" He said, "Your grandfather's story of when he went to the hotel in Miami, and he thought he was God, and they thought he was..." I went, "Oh my God, you remember that story?" He said, "Remember it. It's one of our favorite stories." And tears came to my eyes. I was so touched. And he brought me in Mondeley Hall and announced again to Urich and whoever was seated there, "Alan's going to tell the story of his grandfather." And so I did. And they roared again, Urich and Balnath too, especially the one about I thought I was God and they thought I was God, because they had worked for God all those years. So, what to say about Joseph Tabachnik? He lived a life at 13, fearlessly, and he was a fearless person, obviously. He walked across Europe and took a boat. God knows how he got to America. God knows how he got in. God knows how he survived at the age of 13 in 1905 or 6, whatever it was. But he raised 5 children. He had many grandchildren. One of his grandchildren, not me, was Deputy Mayor of Washington, D.C., and her husband was counsel to the President of the United States. Pretty good, 2 generations. He was a noble soul. Wherever he went, he brought joy and laughter, humor, charm, and it filtered down to his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and probably even great-grandchildren more in the long run. And I will say, maybe because of him, Baba once said to me, and I've never said this to anyone, that your family will be blessed for 10 generations. They all know my name. And I don't think it wasn't because of Joe Tabachnik. He lived a life. He was grateful for his opportunity, never complained that I saw. He was always cheerful and happy and just thrilled to be there. It was always a party, but he was obviously a hardworking, serious man who brought joy to people's lives. He fulfilled his duty, and he fulfilled the first, number 1, of Baba's wish: do not shirk your responsibilities. So I want to thank Robin for giving me this opportunity to tell about this man. His story had to be told and has been told now, and I hope others in the future will be blessed. The YouTube's, my story and my wife's story has been seen by over 1,000 people on YouTube, and my holy food stories have been seen by about 1,000 people. So I hope many, many people have the opportunity to realize that even at the age of 80 and knowing no English, and being a simple man in a certain way, but very clever in other ways, you could speak directly to Baba, and he's your best friend. Jai Mera Baba. Thank you.